Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the atmosphere in Port Charles grew heavier with each passing hour, as whispers of Willow's impending marriage to Drew turned into waves of disbelief and concern that rippled through every corridor of General Hospital, every office at the courthouse, and every home that had once been touched by Willow's long and painful journey. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the collision of unresolved grief, moral dissonance, and deeply buried secrets that threatened to consume everyone involved. For those on the outside, it was just another union between two consenting adults trying to find peace after years of chaos, but for those who had walked the path with Willow, who had fought with her, cried with her, held her hand through funerals and courtrooms, it was a red flag waving violently in the eye of an emotional hurricane. Willow, who had spent years clawing her way out of darkness, navigating the death of her child, surviving betrayal, shielding Wiley and Amelia from the venom of family politics, had shocked everyone when she announced her decision to marry Drew. To her, Drew had become a figure of quiet strength, someone who had offered support when everyone else faltered, someone who told her she could begin again. But not everyone believed in the sincerity of Drew's presence. Michael, who had once shared a life and a mission with Willow, was the first to recoil at the news. It wasn't out of jealousy or nostalgia, it was something far more visceral, more deeply etched in the core of who he was as a father and a protector. He had seen Drew operate behind the scenes, the way he massaged narratives, turned facts into persuasion, manipulated vulnerable hearts in the name of stability. Michael no longer saw Drew as an ally in rebuilding Willow's life. He saw him as a threat to everything sacred that remained. Michael, who once fought beside Willow to ensure they would never again lose their children, now found himself opposing her for that very reason. He believed Drew was dangerous, not in the overt, criminal sense, but in the subtler, more corrosive way that erodes trust and identity slowly, almost invisibly. Michael feared what kind of world his children would grow up in if Drew became a permanent fixture. And when words failed, when logic was dismissed by Willow's unwavering insistence that she had found happiness, Michael crossed a line he had once sworn never to approach. He didn't do it out of spite or hatred, he did it because he felt there was no other way to protect the children, to break the spell that Drew had cast over Willow. He devised a strategy that no one could have seen coming, one that involved the most innocent player of all. While Michael moved in shadows, Nina watched everything unfold from the periphery with a mixture of dread and calculation. Her heart, torn between guilt and maternal desperation, beat with the quiet panic of someone who knew a secret capable of destroying everything she loved. She had spent so long trying to reclaim her role in Willow's life, to prove that she could be the mother Willow never had. But the past had teeth, and it gnawed at Nina daily, especially the piece of it that involved Drew. Once, in a fit of desperation and vengeance, Nina had orchestrated a plan involving Jacinda to control Drew's actions through chemical coercion. It had spiraled out of control. And while she had convinced herself it was behind her, the fear that it could come to light still paralyzed her. If Willow ever learned that Nina had contributed to Drew's manipulation, or worse, that she had done so knowing how fragile Willow was at the time, every fragile thread of their reconciliation would snap. So when Michael came to her, suggesting a partnership that would require moral compromise in exchange for a final end to Drew's influence, Nina didn't hesitate. For once, they shared a goal: protect Willow from herself. They couldn't expose Drew's dark side through the usual methods. He was too clever, too insulated by charm and calculated sincerity. So they turned to strategy, subterfuge, and the one element no one would question, Wiley. Nina hesitated briefly, knowing how cruel and irrevocable the plan could become. But the image of Willow holding Amelia close, free from Drew's manipulations, made it seem almost justifiable. Michael, hardened by desperation, didn't flinch. They crafted a narrative, subtle but effective, and delivered it into the trusting mind of Wiley, framing Drew as frightening, volatile, unsafe. The plan unfolded with heartbreaking precision. Wiley, during what appeared to be a spontaneous and innocent moment with Willow, shared that Drew had yelled at him, locked him in a room, and scared him in a way that made him cry. The words fell like shards of glass into Willow's heart. She froze. The air around her felt suddenly thin. Her maternal instincts surged with panic, colliding violently with her love for Drew. For days she had defended him, stood her ground even when Michael issued ultimatums, but hearing her son describe moments of fear shattered her resolve. Drew denied it vehemently, confused and enraged, begging her to see reason, to understand that someone had planted the idea. But the seed of doubt had already taken root, and no amount of pleading could unearth it. Within a week, Willow called off the wedding. No explanations, no closure, just a statement of finality wrapped in heartbreak. Drew spiraled in the aftermath, gripped by a fury that bordered on madness. He knew someone had manipulated Wiley. He knew this wasn't just the coincidence of a child's imagination. But he had no evidence, no confession, no thread to pull that wouldn't make him look even more unstable. Michael, meanwhile, kept his distance, stoic but tormented. He had saved his children, yes, but at what cost? He had weaponized innocence to win a war against influence, and even in victory, the taste in his mouth was bitter. Nina, too, struggled in silence, dreading the day her part in the scheme, or worse, her history with Drew and Jacinda, would be revealed. Drew, robbed of his future and reputation, began to retrace steps, look for weaknesses in the people he once considered beneath suspicion. And then came the blow that would ignite everything again. Jacinda returned. With help from Nina and Curtis, she re-entered Port Charles and gave a public statement that Drew had willingly taken ketamine, that he had hired her, and then faked victimhood to shield his political ambitions. The media exploded. Drew, who once dreamed of a congressional seat, now watched as headlines called him a fraud, a manipulator, a threat. Willow, broken and confused, stood at a crossroads. The man she once trusted was exposed, and yet the truth had come to her not through honesty, but through conspiracy. The people she had loved and trusted, Michael, Nina, had deceived her for what they claimed was her protection. And as the dust settled over Port Charles, no one emerged unscathed. Not the woman who tried to save her daughter through manipulation. Not the man who sacrificed moral purity to keep his children safe. Not the lover whose lies destroyed his future. And least of all, not Willow, who now found herself alone, her faith in everyone around her shattered, questioning whether love itself was nothing more than a well-rehearsed illusion. Under Michael's calculated guidance, Wiley, though still so young and innocent in appearance, became the unexpected instrument in a larger, morally complicated orchestration to destroy Drew. Michael had reached a point where persuasion, reasoning, and even emotional appeals had all failed to sway Willow from the path she had chosen. Desperate and increasingly convinced that drastic action was the only option left to protect his children from what he perceived as Drew's manipulative influence, Michael crossed a line he never thought he would. With deliberate subtlety, he began to influence Wiley's understanding of Drew, planting small ideas, framing certain moments in ways a child could digest and repeat without realizing the implications. He didn't instruct Wiley with lies outright. Instead, he asked pointed questions, made vague suggestions, and relied on the natural malleability of a child's memory to shape the outcome he needed. Wiley, eager to please and respond to the adults around him, began to repeat those ideas as if they were his own lived experiences. In what appeared to be an innocent and spontaneous moment, Wiley approached Willow during a quiet evening at home. His voice trembled slightly as he told her that Drew had yelled at him once, that he had been so loud it made Wiley cry. He added, with childlike honesty, that Drew had locked the door during an argument and wouldn't let him out. To an adult, these words might have seemed exaggerated, easily explainable by miscommunication or childish misunderstanding. But to Willow, they were daggers to the heart. The memories of being ripped away from her children, the fear of losing them again, the deep scars left by custody battles and emotional trauma, all of it surged back with full force. The thought that she might once again be endangering Wiley and Amelia by trusting the wrong man triggered something primal and overwhelming inside her. Even as Drew adamantly denied the accusations, his voice calm at first, then increasingly agitated, Willow found herself drowning in fear and self-doubt. There was no evidence to support what Wiley said, no bruises, no screaming matches heard by neighbors, no locked doors reported. But it wasn't about proof anymore. It was about the possibility. The haunting whisper in Willow's mind that she had overlooked warning signs before. That she might be doing it again. And that this time, if she failed to act, the price would be her children. The timing couldn't have been crueler. The wedding was mere days away. Dresses had been chosen, invitations sent, arrangements finalized. Yet none of it could hold together the rapidly unraveling trust between Willow and Drew. In the dead of night, Willow sat alone in her bedroom, holding one of Amelia's stuffed animals to her chest, tears rolling down her cheeks in silence. She had loved Drew in her own way, leaned on him when she had nothing else. But now, all she could feel was dread of the consequences, of the loss, of becoming the woman who had ignored a child's cry for help. She made her decision before dawn. The wedding was off. When she told Drew, her voice was shaky but resolute. She offered no detailed explanation, just that it was over, that she couldn't do it, that her children had to come first. Drew stood frozen for a long moment, as if unable to process the words. Then the rage began to build. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the cold, suffocating fury of a man who realized he had been undermined not by evidence, not by truth, but by a child's words, manipulated by someone too cowardly to confront him directly. He knew Michael was behind it. There was no other explanation. Wiley had always liked him, had never shown fear or hesitation before. Drew had shared meals with him, told bedtime stories, helped with school projects. That same child had now spoken the words that shattered his entire future. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. Drew had no way to confront Michael without appearing paranoid or unhinged. He couldn't accuse a child of lying, not without turning the entire community against him. All he could do was seethe, trapped in a storm of betrayal with no outlet for his rage. He left Willow's home without another word, his face carved into stone, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His silence was more terrifying than a scream, and his eyes, once filled with hope and tenderness, now burned with a promise of reckoning. That night, Drew didn't return to his apartment. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Port Charles, his mind consumed by images of Michael whispering poison into Wiley's ears, of Nina lurking in the background, complicit in her own quiet way. He thought of all the times he had tried to do the right thing, to move beyond the sins of his past, only to be dragged back down by others who saw him not as a man, but as a threat. He wasn't angry because he lost the wedding. He was angry because he had trusted too easily, loved too deeply, and now had nothing but wreckage to show for it. The betrayal cut deeper because it came from those closest to him, Willow, who didn't fight for him, Wiley, who he thought loved him like a father, Michael, who used a child's voice to commit emotional warfare. And beneath it all, Drew felt a deeper fear festering, that maybe, just maybe, they were right to fear him. That maybe the very things they accused him of weren't as far from the truth as he'd like to believe. He had never hurt Wiley, never yelled, never locked doors, but he had controlled people, had hidden truths, had manipulated when it served his interest. And now, those old tactics had been used against him with ruthless effectiveness. Drew vowed silently, that night under the shadowed canopy of the Quartermain estate, that he would not let this go unanswered. He would bide his time, gather his own proof, expose Michael and Nina for their treachery, and reclaim the truth, not just for himself, but for Willow, who deserved to know the real villains in this story. And for Wiley, who had been turned into a pawn in a game far too dark for someone his age to understand. Port Charles slept while Drew's world burned in silence, but the embers of vengeance had already been lit. Michael knew, deep in the quiet corners of his conscience, that he had crossed an ethical boundary from which there would be no return. But as he stood at the window of the Quartermain estate, watching the children play on the lawn as if nothing had changed, he clung to the belief that it had all been necessary. He told himself, again and again, that fathers were meant to protect. That sometimes the shield must be sharp, the love must be ruthless, and that innocence was a fragile thing too easily stolen. But no matter how he justified it, the truth remained lodged like a stone in his chest: he had weaponized Wiley. He had planted deception into his son's mind like a seed, and now that it had bloomed, he was left with something far more dangerous than Drew's influence. He was left with a legacy of manipulation that he, not Drew, had created. Nina, meanwhile, found herself living in a carefully constructed cage of secrecy. On the surface, she played the part of the nurturing mother, comforting Willow in her heartbreak, nodding sympathetically when Drew's name was mentioned, pretending she had no stake in the matter beyond concern for her daughter's well-being. But beneath her polished exterior was a soul fraying at the edges. She could barely meet her own reflection without flinching, knowing that if Drew ever discovered the truth, that she had been involved in orchestrating Jacinda's initial scheme, that she had aided Michael's covert efforts to sabotage him, his retaliation could be swift and devastating. Nina had always feared Drew's capacity for control, but now she feared his wrath. She had wounded a man who had once been an ally, and in doing so, she had placed herself in the crosshairs of a storm that had not yet broken. Drew, for his part, was no longer trying to salvage his relationship with Willow. That hope had crumbled beneath the weight of false accusations and poisoned trust. But just as he began to find footing in the rubble of his personal life, the earth shifted again beneath him, this time more violently than before. Jacinda returned. Her presence alone was enough to draw attention, but it was her statement that set the town ablaze. That Drew had not been drugged by anyone, but had instead willingly used ketamine, then staged the scene to blame someone else in order to protect his public image. The revelation sent shockwaves through every corner of Port Charles. The media turned brutal. His political prospects, already wounded, were now lifeless. The whispers became headlines. The headlines became certainty. Drew was now the man who fabricated his own victimhood, a fraud, a manipulator, a liar. He turned to those who had once stood by him, former colleagues, allies, even family. But all he found was silence. Their absence was deafening. Their reluctance to defend him, chilling. Some believed Jacinda. Others simply feared the fallout of associating with him. It was worse than betrayal, it was erasure. Drew realized that he had been abandoned not because he was guilty, but because being near him was no longer convenient, no longer beneficial. He had become politically radioactive and emotionally toxic. The image he had so carefully built, a protector, a second chance, a man of principle, was now splintered beyond repair. Willow stood in the center of the storm, uncertain of every step. Her heart still ached when she heard Drew's name, but that ache was now tangled with dread and confusion. Had she been manipulated all along? Had she projected hope onto a man who only saw her as another piece to move across his chessboard? Or had she abandoned someone who, despite his flaws, truly loved her? The questions gnawed at her, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't have the strength to find answers. She withdrew, from Michael, from Nina, from everything, and sank into a solitary haze of guilt and grief, unsure whether she had escaped a trap or destroyed something pure. But if Willow was adrift, Michael and Nina were bound by the weight of what they had done. Michael, once so sure of his mission, now found himself haunted by his choices. Every time Wiley looked at him with wide, trusting eyes, a shard of shame pierced deeper. He had taught his son to lie. Not just to lie, but to destroy someone with a lie. The victory he had once savored now felt like poison on his tongue. He told himself that Willow was safer, the children were protected, but the price had been higher than he ever expected. He had hoped Drew would lash out, would prove himself the villain. Instead, Drew's quiet devastation only made Michael's guilt harder to bear. Nina, too, began to prepare for the collapse she could sense was coming. Secrets, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of clawing their way to the surface in Port Charles. And hers were volatile. If it came to light that she had hired Jacinda, that she had partnered with Michael to sabotage Drew, not through justice, but through manipulation, It could destroy her fragile reconnection with Willow. She lived every day as if walking through a field of glass, waiting for the sound of a single crack. And Drew did not fall quietly. He may have lost his reputation, his family, his future, but he still had his rage. And it was growing darker by the day. The betrayal had scorched every corner of his soul, and now all he had left was the hunger to reclaim his name, to expose those who had torn it from him. He began to dig. He watched. He waited. He started tracing the timeline of events, identifying inconsistencies, suspicious alignments. He followed money, conversations, movements. And soon, patterns began to emerge, ones that pointed to Michael, and far more damningly, to Nina. As the sun set over the quiet houses and manicured lawns of Port Charles, the illusion of peace still lingered. Children played, couples walked hand in hand, and Drew's name faded from casual conversation. But just beneath the surface, something was brewing, something vengeful, methodical, and irreversible. The alliance between Michael and Nina had succeeded in bringing Drew down, but in doing so, they had awakened a storm they could no longer control. Port Charles had seen its share of betrayals, but this carefully spun web of lies, guilt, and retribution, was only just beginning to unravel.